Hi everybody, today's lecture is entitled Gracile Australopithecines. In the last few lectures we have seen a tremendous diversity of primates from the Paleocene through the Miocene. The humans are a very unique kind of primate and they've evolved over the last 7 million years. Our primate fossil ancestors are a rich and varied lot, and their discovery has stimulated a tremendous amount of interest among both the scientific community as well as in the general public. Given these circumstances, there is no surprise that the interpretation of these finds has generated tremendous controversy. In addition to reviewing the anatomical details that are revealed in the fossil material, in this class we are going to attempt to sort out the complex and different interpretations of the evolutionary relationships of the Pleistocene hominids. And I want to remind everybody that hominid generally refers to a member of the bipedal primate family Hominidae. The beginnings of hominid differentiation had its roots in the late Miocene, sometime between 10 to 5 million years ago. Sometime between 7 to 4 million years ago, hominids began to adapt more fully to their very peculiar ground-living niche. Unfortunately, the fossil evidence from this 3 million year time period is very, very sparse, although there are new finds that are starting to fill in this gap. The majority of evidence for hominid evolutions comes from the African Great Rift Valley in East Africa. This is a 1,200-mile trough extending from Ethiopia, Kenya, and through Tanzania. And every year this trough separates more and more, soil falls down, and new specimens are exposed. This is an example of the rift right here. And this is the Western Rift, and this is the better known Eastern Rift. The rift is associated with faulting, volcanism, and mountain building. These early sediments are brought to the surface through these processes, and the volcanic activity provides dates for these sites. So let's talk about some of the hominids that are found in these sites. The first is one called Sahelanthropus chadensis. I know that's kind of a mouthful. Sahelanthropus chadensis. It was found in 2002 by Brunet et al. In the Jurab Desert in Chad in West Africa. It's nicknamed Tumai, which means hope of life in the Tuboy language in Chad. The name is given to babies that are born just before the dry season. It is a fossil ape that lived approximately 7 million years ago. This is the Miocene. And it's sometimes claimed to be the last common ancestor of humans and chimps. Part of the excitement about this find is that, given its age, this creature probably lived near the time of the divergence of hominids and chimpanzees. So the time period when humans and chimpanzees diverged, according to the molecular clock, occurred between 5 to 7 million years ago. So this specimen occurred, or it had evolved during that time period. It is known from a complete cranium, so we have a whole skull of Sahelanthropus. Its cranial volume, the amount of material that its brain could hold, is 350 cc's. This is similar to a chimpanzee. Since you probably don't know how much 350 cc's really is, think about a pint of beer. 350 cc's is the equivalent of a pint of beer. Contrast that with modern humans whose cranial capacity averages 1,400 cc's. So it's a relatively small-brained hominid. It has also characterized by very large brow ridges, which is also a chimpanzee ape type characteristic. Some people have suggested that this hominid may or may not be bipedal. The location of the foramen magnum, for example, suggests the head was not held over the spine. This contrasts with all later hominids. So some suggest Sahelanthropus is a fossil gorilla. Others have suggested that it might be a female chimp. It's really hard to determine. We do know that it has large brow ridges, so these ridges right here are very, very large. It has a prognathic face that protrudes out. It has post-orbital constriction, so right behind the orbits, the brain goes inward, giving it a kind of a wasted appearance. It has a small sagittal crest, a bony ridge along the central line of the skull, and its foramen magnum is located towards the back. All of these are relatively ape-like characteristics. This is Sahelanthropus. Notice these big brow ridges. Notice the wasting behind. See how the brain comes in behind the eyes? It's not coming out as wide as the eyes. See how the face is prognathic, it protrudes forward. All of this are characteristics of apes. Okay, this is Sahelanthropus. You can see it's got a relatively small brain, and this is the increase in brain size over time. Okay, then we have Auroran tugenensis. Auroran tugenensis was found in 2001 by Dr. Sanut and Pickford. Auroran means original man in the local dialect in Kenya near Lake Baringo. It is considered to be the second oldest known hominid ancestor possibly related to humans, and it is the only species that is classified in the genus Auroran. It's approximately 6 million years old, so it's still within the Miocene, and it appears to have been bipedal. That is, it walked on 2 legs, not 4. The features that suggest that it was bipedal is that it has a femoral head. The size of its femoral head indicates that it was used to support the upper body, and we also see muscle attachments on the femur that also suggest bipedal movement. Another feature that suggests it truly is a hominid is that it has thick dental enamel and small square molars, much like modern humans do. Okay, let's see if we can show you a picture of Auroran. So this is the femur. Notice how big this head, the femoral head is. That is a weight-bearing femur. Okay, and we see some striations in here suggesting that they were really carrying a lot of weight on their legs, and they clearly had relatively long legs on the basis of this. Okay, the next species that I want to talk about is a specimen known as Ardipithecus ramidus. These fossils were found in Aramis in Ethiopia in East Africa, found between 1992 and 1995 by Tim White and his colleagues. They are believed to be about 4.4 million years old. The name Ramid means root in the Afar language. I want to point out that Ardipithecus ramidus was first named Australopithecus ramidus in 1994. It was only after later evaluation of these hominids that people recognized that maybe these Australopithecines were actually more primitive than the other Australopithecines previously found. Thus, Tim White later renamed it Ardipithecus because he believed it was the root of the chimp hominid family tree. So Ardipithecus is now considered a sister taxa to Australopithecus, and it has its own genus name. So what are some of the special things that we know about Ardipithecus? Well, 45% of an entire skeleton was discovered. These bones were encased in limestone. We also have a juvenile mandible with a basicranium, which is the base of the skull, the teeth, and an entire left arm. And so we have quite a bit of fossil material. The foramen magnum, the position of the foramen magnum for Ardipithecus is very far forward, indicating that the head was balanced on the spinal cord. The humerus also indicates that the arms did not support weight in locomotion. So the humeral head is very small, and indicating that they were not used as weight-bearing bones. But Ardipithecus ramidus is not just more modern and having some bipedal features. It also has a lot of primitive features. It has a very flattened cranial base. It has thin dental enamel on its molars. Thin dental enamel on molars is characteristic of chimps and gorillas, not characteristic of modern humans. Large canines, another ape-like characteristic that humans do not possess. And just as importantly, Ardipithecus has an opposable big toe. So its big toe is parallel to the other digits. Instead of being parallel to the other digits, it's perpendicular. It opposes the other toes, much like you have an opposable thumb on your hand. And this suggests that Ardipithecus, although they may have been bipedal, also still relied heavily on movement in the trees. So we believe that Ardipithecus was possibly what we might call a facultative biped. They're bipedal on the ground, but they're quadrupedal when they're in the trees. And this is supported by the fact that the fossil bones were found in relatively heavily forested environments. This specimen is believed to weigh approximately 42 kilos, which is the equivalent of 93 pounds. So this is a graphical illustration of Ardipithecus. You see the opposability of the big toe, the long legs, really long fingers and toes. This is a very primitive trait, and so on. So very ape-like. The next species I want to mention is called Australopithecus anamensis. This is the first Australopithecine fossil that we are talking about. Australopithecus anamensis is found in Kenya, East Africa, and is also found near Lake Turkana. It was found in 1994 by Maeve Leakey, the daughter of Louis Leakey, and it is dated to between 4.2 to 3.9 million years ago. It is the earliest known Australopithecine. It is clearly bipedal because it has a bipedal tibia. The distal portion of the tibia is very, very thick, which is some characteristic that we get when there's a lot of stress during walking that's put on the tibia. The talar articular surface is inferior, and the proximal articular condyles are concave, broad in the anterior posterior plane, and they're equal in size. All of these characteristics of the tibia are indicative that this hominid walked bipedal. And lastly, they have thick dental enamel, or at least thicker than the earlier hominids. And once again, these are classic characteristics of these early hominids, indicating that they were hominids. Now, just because Australopithecus anamensis has some developed traits, more modern traits, it is also characterized by some primitive traits. For one, its dental arcade is U-shaped like apes. Modern humans generally have a V-shaped arcade. Their enamel, although thick, it's thinner than the later Australopithecines, but it is definitely thicker than Ramidus. And it has a large diastema for the canine, a big space for the canine to rest. This is something, once again, only seen in apes. So although it has some more developed, more modern characteristics, it also has some primitive traits. This is an example of some reconstructions based on the bones of Australopithecus anamensis. The black stuff is what we don't have. The orangey yellow stuff is what we do. So you see big brow ridges, you see postorbital constriction, large zygomatic arches, you see prognathism, so the face protrudes out, big monster teeth. Okay. The next species that we need to discuss for our discussion of hominid evolution is Australopithecus afarensis. This is probably the best known of all the species of hominids. For a long time, afarensis was assumed to have represented the founding species of all later hominids and was thought to be the ancestor of all later species. We have many earlier species, but it still represents a pivotal hominid species. It's dated from 3.75 to 2.8 million years ago. It was first found in the 1970s in Kenya, Tanzania, and in Ethiopia. It was in 1973 that an entire skeleton, well, it was really only 40% of a skeleton, was found by Don Johansson's team. They referred to the skeleton as Lucy, named after an old Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Lucy is commonly referred to as KNM-AL-288. The KNM stands for the fact that Lucy is based at the Kenya National Museum. AL stands for the Afar locality, and 288 is the 288th fossil that was found at the Afar locality. As I mentioned, Lucy was 40% complete. She specifically was dated to 3.2 million years, and she is represented as a small female who was 3.5 feet tall, 3.5 inches tall, and 30 kilos. If we were to compare the length of Lucy's arms to her legs, the length of her arm compared to the length of her legs, this is known as the humerofemoral index. You compare the length of your humerus to the length of your upper thigh bone, which is your femur. And in modern humans, the humerofemoral index is 75. Lucy had a humerofemoral index of 85. This indicates that she had long arms relative to her legs, longer arms than in humans. We also, in 1975, Don Johansson's team also found 13 additional specimens of Afarensis, all found together. The general public kind of labeled these as the first family. And so we have quite a few specimens of Afarensis upon which to make, for us to understand this species. We do know that they lived in woodland to dry savanna environments. Their finger and toe bones were much more similar to apes than humans. That is, they had very long fingers and long toes, and that they were curved. So instead of being flattened like this, they were curved more like this at the very tips. This is a very useful characteristic when one is swinging in the trees. When one is walking bipedally, one does not usually need or desire curved fingers. The endocranial volume, the size of the skull, was 404 cc, so it was slightly bigger than Sahelanthropus, but still quite small, just a little bit more than a pint of beer. The pelvis is very similar to modern humans, much more similar to humans than to the pelvis of a chimpanzee. Chimp pelvises are very long and very narrow. Human pelvises are short and wide, so the human pelvis has been flattened and flared, and this increases efficiency in walking. And the chimp pelvis is much more narrower than modern humans. The pelvis for Lucy, for Australopithecus afarensis, is flattened and flared, and is much more similar to modern humans. This suggests that Australopithecus afarensis probably did use bipedal locomotion. However, the fact that their pelvis is still narrower than modern human pelvis suggests that they probably didn't walk exactly the way modern humans do, but probably relatively similar. Some people have argued that their morphology is intermediate between apes and later hominids. So this is an example of Lucy's skeleton, of all the parts that we've had. You see there's very, very little of her cranium, but we have quite a bit of her rib cage. We have half of her pelvis. We have one of her thigh bones, and a good chunk of her lower leg bones. And this is her mandible and her teeth. Okay. This is some of the skulls. Basically, you see this one's kind of crushed and compressed, so it's a little hard to evaluate. That's AL, FR locality 333. This is FR locality 444. You see the very thickened brow ridges. You see the postorbital constriction. You see that the skull is bigger in the back of the head than it is in the front, and that there's nothing really above the eyebrows. Feel above your eyebrows. What do you have there? You have your forehead. These guys don't have a forehead. Okay, and look at how prognathic their face is. It protrudes outward. This is the ear hole, where your ear would be. This is your cheekbone. Okay. Recently, it was not so recently, over a decade ago, but relatively recently, a new specimen of Australopithecine was found in Chad, and it had an age of 3.5 million years ago. This specimen is referred to as Australopithecus baragazali. The most significant thing that I can tell you about Australopithecus baragazali is that it is 2,500 kilometers west of the Great Rift Valley. And the importance of this, it extends the geographic range of the Australopithecines very far beyond what we previously believed their distribution was. So 2,500 kilometers west of the Great Rift Valley. This is a tremendous distribution for these Australopithecines at 3.5 million years ago. One of the things we know about Australopithecus baragazali is that we have a mandibular fragment, a lower second incisor, and 4 premolars. So we don't have a ton, but it's all the material is very similar to Australopithecus afarensis, and some paleoanthropologists have suggested that it is in fact afarensis. Others suggest that its distribution is too far to actually be afarensis. So this is a map detailing the locations of the various species, many of which we've spoken about, but not all of them we've mentioned yet. This is Australopithecus baragazali. You can see how far it is from where afarensis was originally located. This is anamensis, and we haven't mentioned Garhi yet, Paranthropus boisei, Paranthropus aethiopicus. This is Africanus, which I'll talk about momentarily, down here in the south, and Paranthropus robustus over here as well. Okay, so the next species that I want to mention is Australopithecus africanus. This is an important species because it is the first species to be found in South Africa. The majority of the other species that we have mentioned have all been from East Africa, with the exception of Australopithecus baragazali. Africanus is also important because it's found so far from the other Australopithecine specimens. It was the first Australopithecine ever discovered was Australopithecus africanus, and it was described by Raymond Dart in 1924. And they argued, or it's been dated to have occurred between 3 to 2.3 million years ago. Now, how did Raymond Dart come across this fossil? Well, people back then knew that he had a great interest in fossils, and he often received fossils. They sent them to him. And one day he received a box load that had this skull in it. The specimens were from a lime quarry site called Taung in South Africa. And so this specimen that was in this box, he is often referred to as the Taung Child. It took Dart 4 years to remove the skull from the limestone matrix that it was embedded in. Dart argued that this Taung Child represented an extinct race of apes, intermediate between living apes and man. And what can we tell? Why did he make this assessment of the Taung Child? Well, the skull was longer and narrower than any of the other specimens seen previously. He referred to it as dolichocephalic, so much longer and narrower than modern humans. Think about the shape of a football. That's the shape of this skull. They had no brow ridges, very similar to modern humans. The orbits were circular, like modern humans. In the great apes, they have square-shaped orbits, they have thick brow ridges, and they don't have a dolichocephalic head. The face, he argued, was also more human-like than the apes. It was less prognathic, so it was more flatter, not protruding out. But a couple other features were very human-like features. That Africanus had small canines, no diastema. The apes all have big canines. The dental arcade was V-shaped, a very modern human trait. And there was sexual dimorphism. So males were much bigger than the females. And something that was another very primitive trait, in addition to the sexual dimorphism, was that the brain size only averaged 422 cc's. This, once again, is very similar to the brain capacity of chimpanzees. The foramen magnum position indicates that this species had erect posture. Dart named the species and claimed it was the missing link between living apes and modern humans. He published this work in 1925 in the very prestigious journal of Nature. And basically, he was laughed at and rebuffed. Nobody believed him. His work was scorned. There are two main reasons that no one believed that this ape was the missing link. First of all, there was popular skepticism of evolution, and this is true for both evolution in general and human evolution specifically. Remember, this is 1925. It wasn't until the 1930s that there was the modern synthesis, when Mendelian and Darwinian evolution were merged. So all people knew at this point was Darwinian evolution, and Darwin really didn't have a very good understanding of how traits were inherited. So really, a lot of people really didn't buy evolution per se. And secondly, people thought that fossil hominids should have a large brain first, with dental and locomotor changes later. So people believed that the hallmark of humanity was increasing cranial capacity, and what Dart was suggesting was that locomotor changes occurred way before changes in cranial capacity. Unfortunately, due to the hostile response of his peers, Dart never followed up with further excavation, and nothing else was ever found at Taung. And it wasn't until another 20 years after Raymond Dart that his findings were actually corroborated at other sites. So he was an excellent paleoanthropologist, but a little before his time, perhaps. This is an example of some of the specimens. This is the one that Dart took out of the limestone matrix, and you can see how human it looks and why he believed that it was the missing link. Circular orbits, no thick brow ridges, relatively flat face. This is another one. This specimen's known as Mrs. Plez, STS5. Very gracile brow ridges, nothing really above no forehead. We see a little postorbital constriction. We see the brains bigger towards the back, and a relatively flat face, but with some prognathism. And this is STS71, a flattened, relatively flatter face, and reduced brow ridges. So, Dart was disbelieved because people thought that the missing link should have a large brain and an ape-like body. Because most people think that humanness is all about our brains. The people believe that the hallmark of humanity, everything revolves around our brains. This belief was so strong that approximately 10 years before Raymond Dart found Africanus, a man by the name of Charles Dawson, not Charles Darwin, Dawson, and another man by the name of Arthur Woodward, claimed to have been given a fragment of a skull by a worker at the Piltdown gravel in Sussex, England. Dawson took them to Arthur Woodward, and both of them returned to the gravel pit and recovered additional fragments. And then later, at a meeting of the Geological Society of London, Woodward announced that he had created a reconstruction of the fragments which indicated that the skull was similar to that of the modern man, except it had a chimpanzee-like jaw. And so he proposed the missing link. And this supported the theory that human evolution began with the brain. And Piltdown man at that point was called Eoanthropus dawsoni, so he basically had something named after him. During the next 2 decades, there were a number of finds of hominids, and as the years went by, new finds of ancient hominids were made, and the Piltdown man became an anomaly that didn't fit. Between 1930 and 1950, Piltdown man was increasingly marginalized because no one knew how to make sense of human evolution with Piltdown. And it wasn't until 1949 that Piltdown fossils were dated using a new dating technique known as fluorine absorption. And this test established that the fossils were relatively modern, that the fossils were actually young, and that added more confusion to the time frame of human evolution. Then in 1953, the evidence that Piltdown was a fake was first identified at a conference addressing human evolution, when Dr. Weiner suggested that it was a hoax. And the evidence of it being a hoax included unrealistic wear patterns on the teeth, bones artificially stained to match the soil. The exposed areas of dentine were free of shallow cavities. The biting surfaces of the molars did not form a uniform surface. And the molar surfaces were scarred by crisscross scratches, suggesting use of an abrasive. So basically, since 1953, we've recognized that they used a human skull and a chimpanzee jaw and modified it because they believed that is how human evolution occurred. And so now we recognize that Piltdown is and was a hoax and is not a real specimen. So this was the reconstruction of the Piltdown. So let's go back to the real hominids. The next hominid that we need to mention is Australopithecus garhi. Garhi means surprise in the Afar language. It was found by Tim White in 1996, and it's dated to 2.5 million years ago. It has a cranial capacity of 450 cc's, and it is believed to be descended from Australopithecus afarensis. So basically, Australopithecus afarensis gave rise to Australopithecus garhi. It has a human-like humerofemoral index, indicating it has short arms like modern humans. And it's distinct from Australopithecus afarensis in that it has very large post-canine dentition. That is, its premolars and its molars, any of the teeth behind the canines, are large or larger than any other Australopithecine. In fact, the anterior dentition is the largest is larger than any Homo species as well. Despite the large teeth, Australopithecus garhi does not look like Paranthropus, does not look like one of the robust Australopithecines. Its lower face is prognathic. The robust Australopithecines generally have a flat face. It has procumbent incisors, so its incisors, the front teeth, protrude out. The dental arcade is U-shaped. The brachial index, the index of your upper arm to the lower arm bone, is very ape-like. In chimps, the upper arm, lower arm, and femur are all the same length, but the first hominid with modern forearm proportions was probably Homo ergaster. The fact that the forearm was relatively long compared to the humerus and femur means that the femur must have elongated before the forearm shortened in these early hominids. So it gives us a clue as to what came first. So we know that the femur must have elongated before the forearm became shorter. The reason that Australopithecus garhi is in fact my favorite of these Australopithecine species has to do with the fact that the bones were found, the Australopithecus garhi bones were found in association with cut-marked bovid fossils, bovids being cows. Okay, so the cut marks are markings made on bones by stone tools, for example, when removing meat. And so this represents the earliest direct evidence of stone tool use by hominids. So we don't know whether they were the hunters, we don't know whether they were scavengers. We only know that they used stone tools to remove meat from the bones. Imagine you have a nice T-bone steak and you're in a fancy restaurant, so you just can't pick it up and gnaw on it with your teeth like you really want to. Instead, you take your knife and your fork and you're slowly cutting the meat away from the bone because that's where it's the most tender. Those markings that when you accidentally cut the bone with your knife, it'll leave a marking on the bone. That same thing with stone tools. It's going to leave a marking on the bone, the meat bone. These fossils were also associated with a few primitive shaped stone tools. The tools are all older than those acquired by Homo habilis, which was previously thought to be the oldest tool user. So for a long time it was assumed that only the genus Homo had the ability to produce and or use tools. Garhi indicates that this is not the case, that Garhi clearly were using stone tools. So this is what we have for Australopithecus garhi. We have the prognathism, we have the thick brow ridges, and we have some parts of the cranium and the mandible. The next species was very recently found. It's called Australopithecus sediba. It's found at a site called Malapa in South Africa. It was found by Lee and Matthew Berger in 2008. Dr. Daryl DeRuyter from Texas A&M has also been instrumental in studying this species. It is dated 1.98 million years ago. So what can I tell you about Australopithecus sediba? Well, the mandible is very similar to Homo, not Australopithecines. The upper limbs are in fact suited for climbing and suspension. The rib cage resembles apes, not humans. So the upper torso and the upper limbs are all and the high shoulder prevents arm swinging. So we see some things that are indicative, that are primitive, and some that are more modern. The lumbar curvature is more similar to the later hominids, Homo ergaster, than Africanus, so it's very, very modern. And it's been suggested that all Australopithecus sediba, this pattern of locomotion was probably quite different than modern human bipedality, even though they probably were bipedal. This is an example of Australopithecus sediba, and it's so new that we really don't have a lot on it, but it's just a wonderful specimen that we really found, that was found recently, that is starting to shed light on patterns of change in these species. The next species I want to talk about, notice it has a different genus name. It's called Kenyanthropus. Kenyanthropus platyops. It's found in Lake Turkana in Kenya and East Africa, found by Mary Leakey's team in 1999, and it is dated at 3.5 million years ago. It was named to recognize Kenya's contribution to understanding human evolution. Platyops was given as its species name because platyops means flat face in Greek. The type specimen is referred to as KNM WT for West Turkana, 40,000. The cranial capacity is around the same as all the other Australopithecines at 400 cc's. One of the most distinguishing features of Kenyanthropus platyops is that it has the smallest upper M2, the smallest upper second molar of any of the hominids we've seen so far. It also has very, very thin dental enamel, like the chimps and the gorillas do. It exhibits moderate prognathism, so you see some prognathism of the lower face. It has a very small, narrow nasal aperture. This is very unlike Africanus or the robust forms. And another very distinct feature of platyops is that the cheekbone protrudes between the second and fourth premolar, and this is true for the robust Australopithecines, and this is much more anterior than it is in Australopithecus or Homo. Our cheekbones begin right here. Their cheekbones are beginning right here, so it gives them a very flat, forward-looking face. We also see postorbital constriction is similar to that what we see in Australopithecus and the early Homo, not Paranthropus. But probably one of the most exciting things that this species demonstrates is that there were multiple hominids in Africa nearly 3.5 million years ago, and that is very exciting. So here's a graphical illustration of who gave rise to who. So we start out with Sahelanthropus chadensis, and then about 6 million years ago we have Auroran and Ardipithecus. Ardipithecus gave rise to another Ardipithecus, and Amensis gave rise to Africanus, as well as Baragazali, and so on and so forth. And you can just follow this through and see who gave rise to whom. And there are times when nothing gets connected, and because basically that means we don't know that there's something in there that isn't yet clear who gave rise to who. The reason that